It's really great to be here today. This is very much the first stage of a much longer study. I was really excited when I saw the call for papers for this conference because it was work that I've been thinking about and mulling over for quite a few years. It initially started as small little conference paper and it's now a very big project. I say all of this in defense because I'm really presenting some very initial ideas and results today, but I'm very excited at the expertise in the audience, so I'm hoping to get some good ideas of ways to help me as I take it forward. That's my disclaimer at the beginning. So classification schemes are as we know, are a critical part of helping users to navigate and to find knowledge. But if we think about our very traditional, bibliographic, library-based printed classification schedules, if we were to open it up, it contains what looks like basically text. We have notations, we have names of classes, we have notes. If we're jury, we have a very long introduction. We have lots of different things, but they're all basically text. However, contained within that text, which could be a novel or a poem, contained within that text, there are also visual elements. And these visual elements, they're subliminal. They're not really discussed, certainly in library classification scheme literature. Yes, they're discussed in visualization terms, but they're not really the visualization of these traditional bibliographic printed schemes. That's not something that you're going to find typically, when you search for the literature about classification schemes. So we have a type of information which is there, but kind of hidden and not discussed. And these visual aspects of our library bibliographic printed classification schemes, the visual aspects of these is what I'm going to be talking about today. That's my focus for today. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to textual visualization because Marcia showed us some amazing pictures, but that's not the sort of visualization I'm talking about today. I'm talking about visualization of basically entirely text. Then I'm going to have a quick kind of journey into, well, who are classification scheme users? Because it turns out to be a very interesting question. But the main part of my presentation is going to talk about one aspect of classification schemes that gets visualized, and that's hierarchy. So it ties in hopefully neatly to the first talk today. And I'll just say here, and I'm going to keep saying this, there are other really interesting, important aspects of classification schemes which are visualized, and I've been looking at for my study, but there isn't time to talk about them today. So I'm focusing on one today, which is hierarchy. So a few big disclaimers. First of all, I'm only talking about one aspect of classification schemes to get visualized. So I'm talking about hierarchy today, but I've also been looking at the visualization of notation, which is deeply fascinating. You might think it's just numbers and letters, but it's a really interesting visual element. There are some really interesting visual elements. And I'm also looking at things like notes and obsolete numbers. And what I'm going to argue are the kind of paratextual elements and how they're visualized. But not today. For today, I'm not going to be talking about that. If you want to read about that, read the full paper. So that's kind of disclaimer number one. Disclaimer number two is that my study is mostly focusing on analysing printed classification schemes, but I am also looking at how those classification schemes are displayed directly to users, more about users in two slides. So I've been going around libraries and looking at posters and bayends. I'm not mostly talking about that today because of time, but I'll just drop in a few hints about how they compare. So there's a kind of a few spoilers and hints there, but I'm not mostly talking about that. And I promised on my abstract that I'd be talking about the transmutation between these printed schedules and what happens when classification schemes become online tools. So things like WebGUI and things like ClassWeb. Again, not time to talk about them in detail, but I'll drop the odd hint as we go through. But basically, I'm talking about the analysis of the classification schemes today. So that brings me, oh yes, another few things. I'm talking about classification schemes rather than other knowledge organization systems. I think that what I have found could be very interestingly applied to other forms of textual knowledge organization system, but that's not contained within today, what I'm talking about today. And the biggest disclaimer, this is a talk about visualization. You're not going to see today any actual images of classification schemes, and this is for copyright reasons, and the copyright of the classification schemes that I'd like to talk about, that I'd like to show you, are very, very heavily copyrighted. So I'm going to depict things using diagrams instead, which I think is really interesting because it allows us to really focus on the visual elements. Yes, you won't be seeing any pictures of classification schemes. So methodology, At this initial stage, I looked at 6 different classification schemes: the Dewey Decimal Classification, Library of Congress Classification, Colon Classification, 6th edition, UDC, Subject Classification by Duff Brown, and Expansive Classification by Cutter. I mostly looked at the most recent edition, apart from Colon, for various long, complicated reasons, but I did look back historically. And looking back at old classification schemes, as well as being my favourite pastime, but also was really, really interesting for looking at the visualisation and what changes and what doesn't. I'll drop a few hints about those as well, but again, more in the bigger study. And when I did go off to libraries, I've only looked at a very small number at the moment, but I want to be expanding now. So that's all my disclaimers done and my methodology. So let's get on to talking about some visualisation. So what is text visualisation? So what am I talking about? Good question, this time in the morning. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the visual elements of text itself. So things like the layout, the spacing, the blank spaces on a page full of text, choices about style and the choice of the glyphs, i.e. the characters, the things like typography. That's what I'm talking about. And there's not really an official name for it. I've seen in the literature, it's sometimes called a visualization with text. It's a very important book by Brath, which looks at it. To be honest, that book looks at more visual things with more than text. So it's not exactly what I'm looking at, but it's very, very interesting. It's been really, really useful. And the term there is used visualization with text. I'm using the term text visualization. I'm just talking about how text itself is visualized within classification schemes. That's what I'm looking at. Why is this important? Apart from being a niche interest of mine, why is this important? Why am I standing here? Well, I think this quote from Bernard is really, really useful. So Bernard says, the physical fact of the text, with its spatial appearance on the page, requires visual apprehension. So that's a general book about visualization. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my classification schemes? Well, what it means is, even if you can read, if you go into a classification scheme and you see this bunch of text, even if you know all about classification, you know everything about classification, there is still a process where you need to actually understand and apprehend the text. And there is a visual element to that. There's a visual layer to doing that. And that's what I'm looking at, because if we are looking at how people classify and we're studying these classification schemes, but there's this extra barrier, there's this extra layer, there's this extra level of apprehension that I think we need to know about. We need to think about it at least. And that's why I'm looking at this. So it's saying that, yes, the text is on the page and I can read, I think I can read, but we're looking at this layer of information and this layer of communication, which says there's something visual about this. And there are visual messages being communicated to me, even in a bunch of text, and that I, as a classifier or other sort of user, needs to know them. And that's why I'm looking at it. I think this is very important. So who are our users? Well, obviously, the person who uses a classification scheme is the person doing the classification. So in a library, it might be the classifier or the subject librarian or the catalogue or someone like that. That I think is quite straightforward. But there are other users, I would argue, of classification schemes. First of all, the people who use the library users, right? And they use the classification scheme indirectly. The decisions made by the classifier, which are affected, I would argue, by the visualization of that scheme, because that's to do with comprehension, understanding, and all those things. The decisions that that classifier makes, which are a bit based on the visualization, or could be misled, or could be incorrect because of the visualization, they get passed on to the library, and then those decisions affect the users. So I'd say there's definitely library users are indirect users of classification schemes, including of the visualization. That's one area. But I'd also argue that the library users can, in some instances, be direct users of classification schemes. Because in lots and lots of libraries, imagine your local public library or a local university library, you go into the library and you see all the books on the shelves and you see the catalogue and you go, there's an intermediary. There are posters and bayends and all of these signs and signage. And some of those signs I'm not very interested in, which tell you, to be quiet or to not eat. But the signs which display the classification sometimes display what we could consider to be a version of the classification scheme, because they don't put up the schedules of Dewey pinned up onto the ends of the bays or on a poster, but they do have posters. Often libraries have posters and bay and labels which display part of the classification scheme, a visualization of it, a version of it. And there's a really interesting question about that display of classification. Is it the classification scheme? Is it not? Is it a version? Is it a visualization? And that's why I think it's really interesting to look at this. And we can argue that library users are both indirect and direct users of classification schemes, but they might not be users of the same scheme as that the classifier uses. And it becomes I think, a really interesting question. So moving to the main, I say this is a vegetarian, the main meat of the presentation. I'm going to look now at one of the most interesting aspects of classification schemes and how they're visualized. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time. So we've obviously heard a lot about hierarchy this morning, which is great. Hierarchy needs no introduction, but classification schemes, bibliographic, library classification schemes, or however you want to call them, are based on hierarchy. Hierarchical relationships make up these schemes. They're the most important mechanisms of how they work. Hierarchy is absolutely vital to them. Right. These hierarchical relationships, what are they? What do they do? Well, they usually have two elements. First of all, one subject is bigger, broader, a parent of another subject. So we can think about, let's just this morning, food is bigger, broader, and bigger than confectionery. I don't know why I picked that, sweet tooth, confectionery. We always have, in hierarchy, we always have something bigger, broader, and higher up the hierarchy than something lower, at a lower level and narrower. And this is really important. We need to think about this in the visualization. The second thing that we have siblings. We have subjects which are on the same level as the hierarchy as the other. So I wish I hadn't picked this example, but basically confectionery and dairy products, milk products. Okay, they are siblings. They're connected through their parents and come back down the other side. And this is really all that library classification systems do. They don't. But this is one of the main things that they do. And these are the hierarchical relationships we need to think about how they are visualized. So we have parent relationships and we have sibling relationships. So on your left, we have one of many different visualizations of a tree hierarchy. And here we can see bigger subject, smaller subject, and we can see sibling subjects. And we can also see how they very neatly have got lovely arrows leading. We can use figures and diagrams. This is very nice, very simple. As Marta said, there are so many ways of displaying hierarchy. This might be one that we see. And then as you go down in a vertical direction, as you go down, you get to narrower subjects. Okay. Now, and this is the biggest point, the really big point, the only point you need to listen to today. When you get a library classification, a bibliographic classification, you get something like the diagram on the right. So I could have shown you Dewey at this point, or Library of Congress, but I've just simplified it because actually this is just really all I need to show you, this diagram. This is all I need to show you. When you take a library classification, this sort of layout isn't possible because it's basically printed like a novel or a poem. All you've got, basically text and space. That's all you've got. Now there's modern versions and there's digital versions, but in a printed schedule, that's all you've got. What you've got on the right is all you've got. And this is what's really, really good. You don't have these arrows, you don't have the boxes, that's all you've got. So let's take a little look at what's going on here. So this is very, very important. And this space, I'm going to talk about this space for the next couple of minutes here. This space is really important. So what's so exciting about the figure on the right, or not exciting? What's so problematic about it? What's good about it? What's important? This is your typical visualization of hierarchical relationships in classification schemes. Not every classification scheme, but many. So first of all, you've got this indentation, this white space. This is really interesting because it's there. And as Marcia said, and my research has said, this space is everywhere. This is in some instructions of some computer coding. This is in a bullet point paragraph list. This spacing has been around for years and years, decades, hundreds of years. Marcia says thousands of years. I'll take a view on it. This indentation has been around for so long. But it's not always specified or clarified. So that's interesting. Two, the second interesting thing is the dimensions. So here, on a nice figure on the right, nice typical layout, nice visualization, we go down as the subjects get narrower. There's a vertical direction going on here, and it's vertically going down as you get narrower. The same thing happens on the figure on the directions right on the left. The same thing happens. Subject AA is narrower than subject A, and it's lower than it. Subject AB is narrower than subject A, it's lower than it. That is the same. But what's different is what happens to the horizontal direction in the 2D space. So, first of all, two things happen. First of all, siblings. Siblings here are both beautifully visually represented as being on the same line, in the same level. On the figure on the left, in your typical bibliographic library classification scheme, you don't have that luxury because you've just got text and space to play with. You don't have the ability to go across the page, for example. So your siblings end up not being across on horizontal, they also end up being vertical. So at the moment, subject AB, the connection to subject A seems okay. But when you get all the way down to subject, say there was subject AZ, you've been an awfully long way from the parent. But also your sibling relationships also go down the page, and your parent-child relationships also go down the page. You kind of lose that horizontal dimension. The second thing is that you gain a bit of horizontal direction too. So here, we're not really using, the one on the right, the left, we're not really using so much of the two-dimensional space because you're only really going down, you've got one direction going on. Here, we've got two directions. So we go across here, we're actually using the horizontal direction, this 2D space, we're going down and we're going across as well. And that's really exciting. That this space, it just looks like a really boring white space, but actually it's opening up the page in a bibliographic classification, a library classification to be a two-dimensional space. So I think that's really interesting. Fourth thing, one thing on four, which is interesting about the space, I did say I was going to talk about the space for a long time. Fourth thing is the notation. You might have noticed that the notation here, the subjects, I've just come up with a very simple one, that doesn't move across the page. That isn't indented, but the subjects are. And this is typical. In my studies and analysis of the classification schemes, this is typical. There are exceptions. There's always exceptions, but mostly the notation stays where it is and the classes move. Now, this is fascinating. The second part of my study, I'm not talking about today, looks at the display of notation and including the display of notation in conjunction with the classes and the connections and interrelationships between them. No time to talk about it today, but really interesting. And I have a theory why the notation doesn't move in all of this, but not for now. That's interesting. And the fifth thing to say is that in the 6 classification schemes, very small number, still, but the 6 that I looked at, this happened in most of them, but not all of them. And I'll get onto that in the next slide. But it didn't quite happen in every single one, which is interesting. A few final points for this slide. It's going to be a long time on this slide. Do you know, when you look at Dewey for the first time, you just arrived in a library here, have a copy of Dewey, or you're saying to students here, we're going to look at Dewey, how do you know that this indentation, this really important white space, means what it does? How do you know? It won't tell you in the classification manuals generally. And if you pick up a textbook on Dewey, there's lots of textbooks on Dewey. So far, I've only found it in one textbook. I'm still looking. This visualization it's so intrinsic, it's not explained. Someone will tell you 5 pages about all the different notes and what they mean, but they won't tell you that if you move along, that's another subject. And is that because we all know it, because it's been for 2,000 years? What's going on here? It's just really interesting. The omission is very interesting. So finally, what happens when I looked at user displays of this? Did they have this hierarchy? Generally, yes, but less often than in the copies that the librarians saw. So this hierarchical display isn't quite so important, I found, from my very initial studies. And does it transfer over to things like class web and web Dewey? The answer is mostly yes. Interestingly, new versions, data. So we've got these big databases with all the possibilities of computer and digital environment, and they're still using some form of this hierarchical display using the indentation. So I think that's really interesting. Okay, but we'll move off the slide eventually. That isn't the only method of communicating hierarchy in the classification schemes that I looked at. There were a few others, and that's really interesting in its own right. And the ones I want to talk about, the ones based on typography. So there are various different ways that typography is used to communicate and to indicate hierarchy and hierarchical relationships. One is font weight, so things like bold. Example here, Dewey uses bold for the first 4 levels as a hierarchy, which I think is quite interesting. Interestingly, it doesn't do that in its in the web version of Dewey, capitalization, and that's pretty obvious, and font size. And the subject classifications, this is very early 20th century classification. I've given an example here. It uses a bigger font size and capitalization to separate out its main biggest class from the one below. Quite interestingly, capitalization font size mostly used at the top levels, because obviously there's not an infinite number of font sizes that you can use and still be legible if you're down to level 10. So usually font size and capitalization are used kind of at what level 1, 2, 3, 4, but not kind of below that. That's very interesting. Font type used not very often. I did find it to use to indicate one sort of thing, hierarchy, in the first edition of Dewey. Haven't got time to talk about it, but it was very, very interesting. It was used to indicate something in the wrong hierarchy, which is very interesting. So more about that later. So questions about this? Well, first, classification schemes decide to use these methods or indentation. Is it an either or situation? Or do they just use a mixture of everything? The answer is, unsurprisingly, different schemes do different things. So some schemes rely entirely on indentation. Library of Congress classification does that, and that uses quite a narrow indentation. And anyone here has used Library of Congress classification, trying to work out where you are in the hierarchy? Not always so great. Interestingly, so Library of Congress only uses indentation. Dewey, as I mentioned, uses a mixture. Some schemes like UDC and Colon use, I'm very scared to say that either, use typographical methods, but don't use indentation in the same way. So there seems to be a mix. So what's going on there? Do people feel that hierarchy needs to be emphasized? They need to do it in two ways to make sure people see it, why is it seen as more important in some schemes than the others? And I have ideas about why this might be the case, related to notation. Second thing is, second point. What about what does it all mean? What does this mean from a perspective of what the classification scheme is? So there are ideas in classification theory and knowledge organization about the aesthetics of classification schemes and aesthetical qualities. As work done by Janice and Tennis, I've done a little work on it. All of these visualizations, these bold, the indentation, the space, are they for aesthetics reasons? Are they to make the scheme beautiful, easy to read for the aesthetics reasons, or are they there for functional reasons? And this is a really interesting question. Not time to get into it, but I would argue that we've got visual methods which I think are being primarily used for functional reasons, but it's just a very interesting question. And the users, or posters, interestingly, posters, things to users generally had more in the typographical methods than the indentation, and they used typographical methods that the printed classification schemes for classifiers didn't use. So things like color and classes in color. And I think this brings up an interesting point about the genre of what the users see. They see the genre or form of things like posters, which are more likely to be colorful and visual. And does that have an impact on how the classification scheme is displayed? Book printed schedule only got black and white printing versus poster. So you start seeing different visual methods. And this brings up some really interesting questions about the versions of classification schemes. And there's a new visualization, a new version. So to conclude, we have seen, or I've seen, that there is actually a large quantity of visual information in classification schemes. It's there, understudied, I would argue, but it's there. There's a really important phenomenon going on in terms of communicating hierarchy with this indentation, this white space. And this is where the dimensions really come in. There is something about the one-dimensional space and the two-dimensional space and moving across the page, and what is available when you're entirely restricted to just text and space, and how you use the page in those instances, and what is being communicated. There's something very important about how visual information is known. It seems to be tacit knowledge that you just pick up as you learn to classify. And what does that mean for our library users when they see a poster? How are they taught? Even the classifiers don't get told that this is how it works. So that's really interesting. And I think very, very importantly, visualization of classification schemes links to general theories of knowledge organization systems. So we have the idea of the aesthetics of a classification scheme. What is a classification scheme? Is it a work or is it a tool? And I think the visualization links to that. But very importantly as well, links to this idea of versions. So is a new visualization of a scheme a new version? is a poster of a classification scheme, a new classification scheme? Is it a new version? Is it just a new visualization? And this leads me to my conclusion, which is that I think we can start thinking about visual elements as being a whole plane of knowledge about classification schemes in their own right. I'm deliberately paying homage to Ranganathan's planes work here, if anyone's familiar with them, which has three planes, including the notational plane. I think we could argue that there is a visual plane as well. So ultimately, classification schemes have visualization, even textual, bibliographic classification schemes, which just consider text, they have visualization. Is important, and I don't think we truly maybe have looked at it so far and analysed it. And I think if we want to really understand either a specific classification scheme, such as Dewey or library Congress classification, or to really understand the theory of classification schemes, then I think we also need to start looking at some of this visualization